In this demonstration, we're going to use the Kapow Catalyst platform to show a bidirectional integration between SharePoint and Salesforce's Chatter. So in the bidirectional SharePoint to Chatter integration, we're going to use Kapow Catalyst to leverage the Chatter APIs that already exist, the REST APIs that you can use to interact with Chatter. We're going to bypass Microsoft's SharePoint APIs and not use them in the interest of, first of all, showing how the Kapow Catalyst platform can perform integrations independent of whether or not APIs exist. And second, because in general, APIs such as the SharePoint APIs can be difficult to learn, difficult to program to, and we want to cut development time down. So Kapow Catalyst platform can allow us to do that. Traditional integration solutions that don't utilize Kapow Catalyst, generally involve coding, the coding of connectors between systems. You know that when you purchase these connectors that you're purchasing software code, and generally it's a black box. So that if either your source or target systems are customized in any way, then it becomes a services heavy exercise where you're going to have to pay services dollars to have somebody dive into that black box, recode it to work for your particular environment or your particular situation. Traditional integration solutions also require that APIs exist. There needs to necessarily be a programmatic interface to either the source or target systems, or if it's bidirectional, the source and target systems switch. But in either case, these integration solutions require APIs to exist. The Kapow integration solution, utilizing the Kapow Catalyst platform, involves no software coding. There is no black box. It's all very open, and you can see what's going on in the integration. And I think even more powerfully, the Kapow integration solution works independent of whether or not APIs exist. So if APIs on a web application don't exist, you can use Kapow Catalyst to perform an integration between that web application and your systems. Or in this case, even if an API does exist, such as in Microsoft SharePoint, we can use Kapow Catalyst to bypass needing to use those APIs to save a lot of time and integration dollars. In the demonstration that I'm going to be showing you today, we're going to be driving the bidirectional integration between Chatter and SharePoint from Chatter itself. And we're going to be doing that by issuing different commands into Chatter to interact with SharePoint. So we're going to be interacting with the SharePoint document libraries. How we do this is we use the Kapow Catalyst platform, specifically Kapow's Design Studio, to create these automated processes called robots that are going to interact with both Salesforce Chatter, again using Salesforce's APIs, and with SharePoint, utilizing the web interface, bypassing the need to use APIs. But this process is very quick, and from that we can execute these Kapow robots as REST services. We could have also executed them as Java functions or as .NET functions, but you can also publish them as REST web services, which are fairly straightforward, fairly easy to call from Salesforce's Apex triggers to do this integration. From Chatter we can then issue commands such as, hey SharePoint, give me a list of all the files in a particular document library. Or SharePoint, pull this document from a particular document library and then pull a reference to it so I can link to it. Or pull the actual binary file over into Chatter so I have a copy of it in my Salesforce instance. And then bidirectionally you can also issue a command such as you see in the bottom here, SharePoint push, which will push files from your Salesforce CRM instance, or, by the way, from your local server if you want, into SharePoint. So it's a bidirectional integration, but that'll be driven from Chatter itself. So getting to the demonstration and just looking at the environment that we've set up to do it, we have here a SharePoint instance with a very simple document library that we've set up named test. We have a fairly small set of documents that we put in here, all different types, PDFs, Word docs, Excel, etc. Kapow can scale to work with systems that have literally hundreds of thousands of documents, and we've done that in different engagements that we have. But for the demo here, we're going to have a fairly small document library. And this is an internal SharePoint instance of Kapow behind our firewall, but it could be living anywhere out on the cloud. And then you look at the familiar Salesforce Chatter interface that we have, and this is where we're going to be issuing the commands that I described in the last PowerPoint slide, where we're performing the integration. So actually we can start doing that now. So from Chatter, if I say, maybe the first command that we have, SharePoint get files, and then what I'm going to do is pass it a parameter, the name of the document library from which we want to get those files. And in this case, we just want to get a list of the files that exist in that document library. And this is our document library in SharePoint named test. And in Chatter, I'm going to issue the command SharePoint get me the files, or list me the files that are in that document library test. When I hit share in Chatter, you're going to see that my status shows here that a list of those files that we just saw in the SharePoint instance. We could have formatted this in any way that you really want. We could include any data from SharePoint, such as like the file size and the file type and all that kind of good stuff. But just to keep it simple, we included in this list the file names of each of the files that are in that document library, and then also their last modified dates and times. So how is this done? How is this performed? As we suggested in the PowerPoint slides, when I issued that command SharePoint get files, what's going on behind the scenes is the Apex trigger is getting fired here in Chatter, and then in that trigger we're calling what we call a Kapow robot in the Kapow Catalyst platform as a REST service to get this information back from SharePoint. If we switch to the Design Studio in Kapow Catalyst, you can see that the robot that we created to do this is a fairly simple process. Looking at Design Studio up here where my mouse is moving, you can think of it as a robot as like a flowchart. And as a robot builder, you want to create and edit that flowchart here in Design Studio. So very generally, without getting into too many details, the top branch of this flowchart is dedicated to grabbing those files and the file names and the last modified dates and times from SharePoint. And you can see that here, since I have selected up here in this Design Studio interface a step in that top branch, in the browser view here, I literally have SharePoint working actively in real time. So the robot logs into SharePoint, and Kapow Catalyst platform supports any sort of security that one finds out on the web, whether it be form-based authentication or other sort of more advanced single sign-in or cookie-based authentication, or things like plain text, etc., etc. In the top branch of this robot, in the browser view here, where my mouse is now, makes it very easy to do things like click on elements in this web interface and do things like extract the data from them and then return them, and that's what we did here. The bottom branch of the robot then does things like, given my various Salesforce authentication, like my client ID, my client secret token, my security token, it's go call the REST web service in Salesforce that's going to get me an OAuth token so that I can authenticate. So that's what this step does. Now when we click past it, in real time, we're literally making that call. And in this case, there's not a web interface involved, but what gets returned from that REST service call is a bit of JSON. The Kapow Design Studio can process and display JSON, XML, again, any sort of web interface that you want, plain text, CSVs, Excel files. Within PDFs, you can grab data. So there's all sorts of different FTP sites, like local file directories. So you can really render almost any kind of data here in this browser view. In this case, we have JSON coming back, so we can do things like grab our OAuth token, our instance URL, and then actually make the Chatter post here by calling another REST web service here at the end of this branch. So again, this is just an example of the Kapow robot that really drove the process that you just saw from the Chatter command that we did. So this, for me, somebody who's trained to use the Kapow software, is like a 10-minute job to create this robot. I didn't have to go learn SharePoint APIs. I did, for demonstration purposes, make use of Salesforce APIs. I didn't even have to do that, really. Could have gone through the web interface of Chatter, but it's really the developer's choice of the robot as to what they want to do. You can take advantage of APIs, as we have with Salesforce in this bottom branch, or you can take advantage of the web interface. And these can be really rich, as SharePoint is, really rich web interfaces with a lot of JavaScript, a lot of AJAX and event-based JavaScript. So it can be very complicated web interfaces. Kapow Catalyst has its own browser engine that can process these kind of more advanced web applications. So with a little bit of how the demo was done described, we can move on to other parts of the demo and other commands that we can issue. So now that we have a file list, one command that we implemented is to pull files from SharePoint into Chatter. Here I say SharePoint pull, and I'm going to pull this file by reference. In other words, I'm just going to have Kapow go grab me a link to the file and put it here. Again, I want to grab it out of the document library test, and then in this case I want to provide it a file name. So we have a file up here, a PDF that I created for the demo called sample PDF. So we're going to issue that as our file name in this case. We hit share, and again when we hit share, that Apex trigger is being executed, and then behind the scenes the Kapow robot is being run as a REST service. So when I refresh Chatter, you can see that that sample PDF is pulled in to Chatter from SharePoint by reference. So what do we have here? We have a bit of text that I put up here for demonstration purposes. A file reference coming from SharePoint via Kapow. We have the sample PDF file, and if I put my mouse over this, you can see that it's actually going to link us back to SharePoint, where we can download the file directly, and then you can see the file just came in from the user Kapow software demo. So that's the case where we're pulling data from SharePoint into Chatter. Now we also implemented another command where I wanted to just show some of the flexibility of what you could do with Kapow. Again, you could do really anything you want in this regard, but in this case I'm going to issue the command where we want to pull files by date. So we want to pull multiple files that have been modified after a certain day. You can do anything you want or have any sort of input parameter you want, but this is just one example of what you can do. Now this time, instead of pulling the files by reference, I'm going to pull the binaries themselves. So that's what this first parameter is, the file, and that's what I'm putting instead of reference in this case. And I'm going to provide it a day. I'm going to pull files that have been modified on or after this day. So when I hit share, the Chatter Apex trigger fires, goes and calls a Kapow robot that I developed as a REST service. The same robot that I used to pull a single file here, same robot to pull multiple files by date. And that's the kind of flexibility you have with Kapow. You don't have to write a new robot for every bit of integration that you do. You really just, as a developer, want to do what makes sense, and I think what made sense in this case was to just keep that in one robot. So I hit refresh in Chatter once again, and now we see multiple documents, actually 3 in this case. I hit show more, there shouldn't be any more, yeah. 3 in this case that were where we actually brought over the binaries. So Kapow can work with binary data, any sort of attachment that you want, and move that in and out of systems. Very, very easy to do. If we switch back, there were 3 files that were modified on or after the 20th of September. So that seemed to match up what we got here in our output. So that's another example of a command that we implemented for this demonstration. So the last part of this demonstration is going to show the other direction of the bidirectional integration, where we're going to take a file that's in Salesforce CRM and push it into SharePoint. So in this case, what I did is put a file called example.java within the Documents tab of Salesforce. So this document could have just as easily been associated with an opportunity or a contact, but in this case I'm going to utilize the Documents tab in Salesforce. So now in Chatter I issue the command SharePoint push. This time, again, we're going to push it into the document library in SharePoint called test. I'm going to tell the Kapow robot that we're calling here that we want to get the file from Salesforce. Again, we want to get the file from that Documents tab within Salesforce CRM. I could have also told it that I wanted to get the file from the file system out on the server, but it's sort of less easy to demonstrate a file coming from the server. So I'm going to just stick with Salesforce in this case, and then give the file name of the file that we want to push. Hit share. Now a Kapow robot that it took me about 10 minutes to write is now interacting with the SharePoint web interface in real time, this time to take the file from Salesforce and put it into the web interface of SharePoint. So if we switch over to SharePoint and hit refresh on the browser, there's our file that we had in Salesforce CRM previously coming into SharePoint in real time. And again, if you wanted to do this in bulk, like issue a command that said push all files from this part of Salesforce into my SharePoint instance, you could just as easily do that. But for demonstration purposes here, just pushing one file. Kapow robots can do almost anything that a human being could do on the web, except of course in an automated way. So that includes not only grabbing data from the web in any way that you want, but also here you can see uploading a file into SharePoint through the web interface.